All right, everyone can see? All right. Hi, everybody. As Cooper said, my name is Ryan. I'm an undergrad here, currently doing research on this thing called evolutionary computation. So I wanted to do a quick, small little seminar to talk about it in case it's relevant to any of your projects or just any random interest that you might have. So I just want to get a rough estimate in the room. How many people have actually heard this word, like evolutionary computation? All right. Far fewer than I thought, because there's always these videos on YouTube that are like these people training little agents to play stupid games like Donkey Kong and stuff online. Those are all roughly using evolutionary computation. So if you see those, most of the really simple projects actually use something like this, mostly because they didn't want to do any backpropagation, they didn't want to do any learning. So they instead talked about doing it through evolution. So quick little outline today, we'll talk about first what evolution is, and then we'll talk about how you can use it to optimize neural networks, and then we'll learn how you can, what's the benefit of using evolution to train neural networks over something like backpropagation. All right, so back to biology. We'll talk about evolution for a bit. First off, for evolution to actually happen, we first need this prerequisite population with genetic diversity. So all that means is we have a lot of different individuals, so it has to be a lot, and it has to be many different ones. And we have a large variety of them. That's key. From this population, we get a selection that occurs. Okay, now this is usually, people call this natural selection, which is basically where the less fit individuals most likely survive. So you can see here, if we look at giraffes as this metaphor here, the taller giraffes are likely to survive because they can reach the taller branches of the trees, and they can get more food than the shorter ones. And so there's selective pressure against being short. And so you can see that on average, the giraffes that were selected are a bit taller than the ones that weren't selected. Now, it doesn't mean they all have to be. One of the giraffes that wasn't selected is actually taller than one of them that was. But it doesn't really matter. It's a stochastic process, so you don't really know exactly what's going to happen, but you just know that there's pressures in certain directions. So once you get this selection to occur, you actually have to do reproduction. So you take the fit individuals that were selected, and then you create with the same genes as those, more individuals that likely share those same characteristics. So you have this reproduction event, and now you can see the giraffes, on average, got a bit taller in this one generation that we just saw. So we call this whole thing one generation, where we have a population, selection, reproduction. And you generally do this in a loop. So you actually do many generations over and over again in a loop, and eventually you terminate once some condition is met. In nature, there is no termination. It's still going. But in most computer science applications of this, it will eventually terminate, and you'll eventually stop doing this loop here. So I mentioned survival of the fittest, and this is something that's usually the catchphrase of evolution, which basically says you have a set of individuals, and somehow you have to determine some of them will survive and some of them won't survive. So for the rest of today, we're going to talk about an individual as being just a random binary vector. So it's just going to be denoted theta here. So you can see it's just zeros and ones. You could alternatively have it as a real valued vector. So you could have it in R if you'd like. But really, everything can be represented as binary, so we can just say it's binary here. Now, the f of theta is just a function that we define, and it's called the fitness function. So the fitness function is basically how good an individual theta is. So in the giraffe example back here, the fitness is how tall the giraffe is. And you can see that the taller giraffes have a higher fitness, and they're likely to survive. So fitness is basically who has a higher chance of surviving. All right, so is that good so far? All the biology background? All right, cool. So now we talk about one of arguably the most important steps of evolution is this selection step. And that's the step where you pick which individuals get to survive to the next generation. So just to keep this in good notation, let's just say we have a set of individuals, theta 1 through theta n. So these are just random binary strings, whatever you want to call them. They're a bunch of individuals. And the question that we have to ask when we're trying to perform selection is, how do you pick k of these individuals to be the parents for the next generation? So k could be equal to the population size, so k could be equal to n, or k could be 10, and k could be really small, where it's just a small subset that you're trying to pick to be the parents for the next generation. So this is just an open question. So we have f of theta I for every single one of the theta i's. How do we actually pick the best ones? What are we going to actually do to pick k of them? Does anyone have any ideas? What can we do? Yeah. Kill them. Which ones specifically? That's the question. Which ones do you want to kill? Or which ones do you want to keep to survive? For example, Donkey Kong or something. Sure, yeah. Whichever one survives the longest. Sure, okay, yeah. So you have just a linear feature that says f of theta I is how long the individual that's parameterized by theta I survives. And then whichever individual survives for the longest, we pick the k longest. Okay? So that's sort of like an elite selection, where only the most elite individuals survive. But you could argue that maybe there could be a benefit of being really weak for a few generations. Like, for example, in Donkey Kong, if you actually go really slow at the beginning, maybe you discover a different pathway to get to the top way faster than the other one. So maybe you do still want a few lower level bad solutions. Maybe you do. So does anyone have any idea? How do you mix like the really good solutions that you obviously want to propagate a lot, but then also you want a bit of diversity because you want the solutions that are bad because they might lead to good ones in the future? Yeah. Yeah. Cool, yeah, exactly. So we pick like n minus k of them to be, or whatever, you pick a small subset of them to be the elite ones, the really best ones, and then you pick a bunch of them at random. That's a really good option. So in evolution, there's really mostly two that are used a lot, and then one that I think should be used more. So the most common two are fitness proportionate selection and tournament selection. So what fitness proportionate selection basically says is roughly what you said, where we have the chance that you're selected is proportional to your fitness. So if you have a higher fitness, you have a higher chance of being selected, but you're not deterministically going to be selected. There's a chance that even the person that has the worst fitness is actually selected because they have like 0.1 and the random number generator was in your favor in this generation. And that makes sense because even in nature, low performing solutions sometimes do survive out of pure luck, right? So you can imagine this is sort of like if you have higher fitness, you're more likely to survive, but it's not necessarily sure. Another option, and this is actually the most popular today, is called tournament selection, where you take the entire population first, and then you downsample it to just t individuals. So you pick a tournament of t individuals completely at random. Then, from within this tournament, you pick just the best individual. So you do k times, you pick t individuals, and you pick the best individual from that tournament each time. It's a bit confusing, but does that make sense? Does everyone, yeah? So with tournament selection, you can have adaptive selection pressure. So when you first downsample it to t, you might have actually forgotten the best person. Like he might have not actually been selected in the tournament. So the best person doesn't necessarily get selected. You actually get selected like only if you're the best within your niche, like within your group of people that are around you. And this makes sense in evolution too, because if there's a group of high-performing individuals that live in a different forest to you, there's not going to be any interaction between you. So really, it's the best from them and the best from your group that are going to be selected instead, as opposed to there being any competition between you. Now, the final one, and this is one of the areas that I'm doing research in, is called lexicase selection, which is basically doing a stochastic process, completely at random, where you select individuals based on a random order of fitness functions. So you actually don't only define one fitness function for each individual, you actually define many fitness functions, and you pick those fitness functions at random because some individuals might do better on some fitness functions than others. And so you actually get this diversity of population and you get eliteness at the same time. So it's pretty interesting. If anyone has any questions, feel free to talk to me after class if you'd like. So, all right, so that's the key of selection. Now, for us to be able to do selection, we need something to do selection on, right? So in nature, we have this genotype-phenotype difference here. So when we have a genotype, we're usually talking about things like DNA, which is like our actual genes and our chromosomes. And when we talk about phenotypes, it's what our DNA encodes for. So that's usually like the actual human body that you become, right? It's the actual person that your DNA encodes for. Now, when we talk about this in the computer science metaphor here, is when we have the genotype being theta, we now have a lot of options for what the phenotype could be. Because theta can parameterize anything. Because I know we all know that binary can represent anything in computers, because it does. So we can actually have a lot of freedom here with what we represent. And that means we have a lot of freedom with what we can evolve. So one of the first things that you can use theta to encode is a genetic programming tree. So this is just an abstract syntax tree that computes an arbitrary function. Now note that this is a symbolic equation. There's no, like, it's not an actual neural network per se because there's a cosine in it and there's division and stuff. This is an arbitrary mathematical expression. So this can actually be evolved, and you just need to decide how theta parameterizes that phenotype. You can maybe make it like, oh, I'm going to have a list of all the nodes, and then I'm going to have a list of all the connections between the nodes, and then what function is being computed at each node. You could do that. And at the leaves, it's all the literals. So that's genetic programming. That's a really common thing. I'll talk a bit more about this towards the end. Now, this is for everyone here. Most probably, this is the one you're most interested in, is neural evolution. So this is when you take theta and it parameterizes an actual neural network. We have evolutionary reinforcement learning. So we take theta and it actually parameterizes a policy, pi of theta. And that policy can be played in an actual Atari environment, for example. And we have evolutionary robotics, where theta actually represents both the body and the control hierarchy of an actual robot. So you can see here, this was like, I think it was like 1990 or something. This guy, Carl Sims, used a evolutionary algorithm to encode robot bodies and their actual movement patterns at the same time with the same genotype encoding, which is really cool. Okay, so on to neural evolution. So how do we actually encode a neural network? The question is, how do we take theta and get it to encode a neural network? The first option is that we could just set theta to be a vector that stores all of the weights of a fixed topology structure neural network. So it means that we have to make theta be all of the weights of a neural network. We just like dot flatten and we take all the weights. Can someone tell me, why does it have to be a fixed topology structure? Why is it really, really hard here to make it a changed topology? Like, how do we can't store two different neural networks that have two different topologies here because we have a vector. So does anyone have an idea about why it's probably really hard to store different structures as opposed to just the weights? It is a kind of nuanced question that maybe none of you have thought about, but it's very important for this kind of stuff. All right, I'll give you a hint, and it's that theta has to be the same length. Because when you're doing evolution, you're doing crossover, and you're doing all these mutations, you want to make sure that theta always represents the same thing. And so if you randomly start having theta having different lengths, you might lose what represents what and what encodes for what weight. So effectively, that's what you have to think about. So why does it have to be a fixed topology? And how can we encode both the weights and the topology are both questions that are really, really hard to answer. So the first one actually you can answer is, why does it have to be a fixed topology? Well, because we don't know what weight is actually represented by what value in theta. So like if theta is 1, 2, 3, we don't know what weights in the neural network are 1 and 2 and 3. So it's hard to find that transition. But if it's a fixed topology, we can just say that the first value is the first weight, the second value is the second weight, third value is the third weight, etc. So the question now is, sure, we can do it fixed topology, but really we want to take advantage of evolution and be able to change both the topology and the weights at the same time. So that's where one of the most famous evolutionary algorithms comes in, which is called neural evolution through augmenting topologies, which is also known as NEAT. So maybe a lot of you might have heard this one. This is usually the one that they use in the YouTube videos that play games. This was proposed by Stanley and McLennan in 2002. So it's really simple. They represent the genotype, which is this theta, as this gray box at the top, where we have two different lists. We have a list of nodes and we have a list of connections. So the list of nodes, basically here we have node 1, node 2, node 3, node 4, and node 5. 3 of them are sensor nodes, and 1 of them is an output node. You can see that in the actual neural network here at the bottom. 3 of them are sensors, and 1 of them is an output, which is number 4. And then we have 1 hidden node, which is number 5. So this doesn't really look like a neural network that you've studied in this class for sure, because it's really, really small, number 1. Number 2, it's sparse. There's not a connection between every set of nodes, right? We have only a connection from 2 to 5, but we don't have a connection from 3 to 5, for example. So you can think of connections that don't exist as just a connection of weight 0, if you'd like, if that makes it easier for you to think about this. So the list of connections is just saying, it's just a list that says what 2 nodes it connects and what the weight it is. So obviously between node 1 and node 4, there's a connection of weight 0.7. Between node 2 and node 4, there's a connection of weight 0.5, for example. And there's also these 2 other things, the enabled and not enabled, and these things called innovation numbers, but we're not going to get into that here. That just allows for you to do things like, instead of deleting a connection, you can actually just turn it off for a couple generations like we have. So we have a lot of DNA in our genotype that actually is not actually created in our body. It's not actually expressed. And that's sort of doing the same thing here, because it allows you to explore more when you have disabled genes. And because at a future step, you could re-enable it when it actually might be helpful. OK, so we've covered a lot so far. So we have the genotype, we have the phenotype, which is the neural network. Now the question is, we have a neural network, right? So the question is, how do we evaluate that neural network? And that's a really open question, because how do we evaluate it? Well, first off, we have to ask, do we evaluate the genotype or the phenotype of the neural networks? Are we evaluating theta, or are we evaluating the thing that theta creates? Think about it in nature. What's being evaluated? Is it the genotype or the phenotype? Yeah. Yeah, the phenotype, right? Because there's nobody is saying like how well your DNA performs, right? It's not your DNA, it's the thing that your DNA creates, which is you, that's actually being evaluated. So obviously, we evaluate the phenotype here. So the question is now, given a theta, we have to first find the phenotype, however we want to do that. In NEAT, I gave you a really good way to do it, just by taking the theta, making it represent two lists, and each list corresponds to nodes and connections. Now the question is, we have this neural network, how do we get f of theta, which is the fitness function? Now, as you'd expect, it's going to depend on the problem that you're trying to solve. Okay? So a lot of you are going to encounter problems like this in your time with machine learning, and so figuring out good and effective fitness functions is very much similar to finding good loss functions. Now, the hint is it's a lot easier to do it with fitness functions than it is to do with loss functions, because you don't really have to think too much about what's happening when you backpropagate through it, because you don't need to backpropagate through it, and I'll get to that towards the end. So we'll just do a quick, this is pretty easy. I'm going to show you a domain, and then you have to try to tell me what's the best fitness function for this domain. Obviously, I don't know what the best fitness function is, but there's a lot of really good options that you can pick from. So here's the first one. Let's say we're trying to train a neural evolution algorithm to play Mario Kart. What could be the fitness function here? So we have theta, which is just the actual parameters of the neural network, and then we have the neural network, which is shown at the bottom of the screen. What could we do? Yeah?
I mean, I guess you could say if you don't get first place.
Yeah. So you can make it a really sparse reward where you say, only if you win the game will you get selected. And then we say, like, your fitness is 1 if you win the game, or 0 elsewhere. That one is good, but it seems like you're going to have to win a game before you even get any signal at all from the network, right? You're going to have to, by accident, win the game for you to know, oh, wait, that selected me, right? It's like kind of like the reward shaping in reinforcement learning. Yeah, do you have something to say? Yeah, time to finish line. That's a really good one. And that's a really easy one, because first you have to get to the finish line, and then if you got there slowly, it doesn't matter if you were in last place, but you got there, you can actually still get some signal there from the system. What else? There's a few more obvious choices, maybe, yeah? Yeah, so like how many times you overtake in the game. Yeah, that's a really good option too. And that's one that happens, maybe you don't even finish the game. Maybe you just run in circles, you never actually know, but sometimes you might overtake by accident. So yeah, go ahead, Jan. Yeah, exactly. How many times you use those power-ups and hit other players. So there's a lot of options. And it actually turns out that usually a combination of all the things that you said would work pretty well. So you say it's 0.1 times how many people you hit with shells, and it's 0.2 times your average speed, and 0.3 times or negative 0.3 times the time it took you to finish, because you want to decrease that. And so you can craft these fitness functions however you want. And there's no real constraints here about what the fitness function has to be. So we'll look at another example now. What if we want to do a robot walking, so either in simulation or in real life? What could the fitness function be here? Yeah. Distance walked, right? Perfect. That's a really good one. There's a few other choices here. Does anyone know? Anyone have an idea? Yeah? Number of falls, right? You want the inverse of that. You want to decrease the number of falls. Yeah? Yeah, time standing up, right? Time not like touching the ground with your shoulder. That's a good example too. Other things that you could consider could be, oh yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Is there average speed?
Yeah, average speed is a really good one too. So you can think of it being just really any metric that you want to optimize for. So maybe if you want a robot that's more stable, you could actually add that to the fitness function. So you say that maybe the robot, I want it to not have a center of mass move of more than 10. And the more your center of mass moves, the less good it is. And I say move, I mean like up and down move. I don't want you to be bouncing around because that's wasting energy. You could literally say it's just how much energy you waste, and just define energy waste as how much power your actuators use in the motors. So you have a lot of options here again. And there's no constraints about differentiability, and we'll talk about why in a second. All right, I think this is the last one. If we're trying to do an image classification, so you can actually evolve a convolutional neural network just like you could learn one. But let's say we have a convolutional neural network phenotype. How do we actually evaluate it? This one might be a bit out there because it doesn't make too much sense in the natural picture that I've been painting so far. Yeah?
Like the number of or percentage of times you got it right?
Yeah, exactly. It could be like you're just accuracy. The more accurate you are, the better. I think that's pretty much one of the only choices. I think there's maybe a few more, like how many times you, or like your confidence. It could be your accuracy times your confidence. So if you're really confident and you got it right, that's good. If you're really confident and got it bad, that's really bad. So you could weight it in certain ways too. All right, great. So now we've talked about the encoding. We've talked about how we evaluate that encoding. So now that we have the fitness functions, we talked about selection at the beginning. So let's now talk about selection and reproduction again in the context of neural networks. So really, the first step is something that we need to do, with whichever selection algorithm that we pick, is just we have to select a pool of high-performing individuals. So either we use tournament selection or Lex case selection, or we use fitness proportionate selection, which nobody really uses anymore, to pick a set of individuals. Then you take those individuals, so the k individuals that we pick, and we mutate and or cross over them so that we can actually get a new population. So there's two different kinds of reproduction usually that people use, which is mutation and crossover, which is asexual and sexual respectively. So the asexual reproduction is basically where you take a single individual and you just randomly mutate it. So you don't use any other individuals in the population. You simply pick a single one and you make some random changes. You can think of that as adding, if we're using real valued vectors, you can think of that as adding just Gaussian noise to the individual. If you're doing sexual reproduction, this is where you take two different parents and then you randomly pick a split point and then you kind of cross them over. So you take half of the individual's parameters from one parent and the other half from the other parent, and you mix them together. And this can be thought of as like a mixture of Gaussians model here, where you have two different Gaussians and you're mixing in between them and interpolating. Yeah. Yeah, all of this, sorry, I should have been clear. All of this reproduction happens on the genotype. There's no phenotype reproduction, because the phenotype could be something that you just, how do you do that? Like, you can't reproduce two phenotypes. Yeah, is that it?
Yeah, and if it's like neural networks, how do you make sure it stays like that?
Good question. So when we have two neural networks, the way that NEAT does it is they line up the two different, actually, it's on the next slide. But when you're doing with neural networks, if you have a fixed topology neural network, you just have to make sure that the two different, the weights that you're crossing over are the correct weights from each parent. So if you take like the first layer from one parent, you take the second layer from the other parent. It's easy to do, but when you're doing it with changing topology, it gets pretty tough, which is I'll talk about in a second. So in general, they actually do both. So they first do crossover and then they do mutation. That's likely because you don't want to just have it as a clone, like half of you being your father's side and half of you being your mother's side. You have half roughly, and then you also have a bit of mutation that happens too. So any questions about reproduction? No? Okay, cool. So in NEAT, if we were going to do some mutations in NEAT, the first thing that you do is, there's two different kinds of mutations first. We have connection mutations and node mutations. So the connection mutation is just adding a random connection. So you just pick two nodes and you randomly add a connection between them. There's another type of mutation where you randomly add a node and then maybe you randomly add a connection to another node so that the node is not just sitting there in space. And there's always the option of removing a connection, removing a node. There's all these different choices for mutations. But it basically has to act on the genotype, and you randomly change the genotype in certain ways. So either by adding a connection, adding a node, et cetera, et cetera. Crossover is a lot more difficult, as you can imagine, for the reason that you raised, is that how do you know what parts of the parents are allowed to be crossed over? Like, if you have two different convolutional neural networks, you don't want to cross over like the linear layer of one parent with the actual like convolution filtering layers of another parent. That would just make no sense, and the neural network that results would likely not work, and likely would not even output the correct dimensions. So you want to make sure that you're doing this thing called homologous crossover, where the things that you're crossing over are things that actually represent the same kind of thing. Now, big scare quotes here because it's really hard to know what parts of the neural network do what. But as long as you can be within, like, as long as you're being honest and you're trying your best to do it, it usually works. So the way that they do it in NEAT is with those things called the innovation numbers before, where you basically store what generation the innovation first happened. So if this node came out in generation 10, then you know that all the nodes that came out in generation 10 are sort of representative of each other. So if you have all the nodes that came out in generation 10, you could actually like cross over any of those nodes within each other, and they still represent the same thing. And that's not really necessarily a very accurate heuristic about what two things represent the same thing, but it works really well in this work here. So you line the parents up, by their innovation numbers, and then you randomly pick between the two. So you see if parent 1 and parent 2 both have a thing in innovation number 1, you randomly pick between the two. And if one of the parents has something in an innovation number where the other parent doesn't, you just take it from the higher fitness parent, which makes sense. All right, so now all of you probably have a pretty good grasp of how backpropagation works. So I just wanted to give a little contrasting with evolution versus backpropagation. So in evolution, we really have no concept of gradients. The way that we do this learning is actually through this thing called the natural gradient. So if you look here on this image, we have genotype space at the bottom, which is like the xy plane, and then in the z dimension, we have fitness. And as you keep doing these selection and mutation operations, you're actually climbing this hill, and you're getting to the top of this local optima that you're finding, this global maximum. This looks a lot like the inverse of your loss curves that you normally see, where you have like parameter space as xy, and then you have losses going downwards as being better. So it's sort of like the flip of that, because you want to promote fitness, whereas you want to decrease loss usually. So this actually is really good because we never have to differentiate the actual loss function. We never have to differentiate the fitness function here. And we don't actually need one. So this is called black box, because all we do is we have a genotype, we pass it into whatever the fitness function is, whoever defines it, and then we have to do something with the value that that fitness function outputs. We don't even need to know what the fitness function is doing. The fitness function could be a random number generator for all we care. It doesn't have to do anything with the phenotype either. But you obviously want it to do something with the phenotype. So this has a lot of benefits, right? So we don't have the constraint on differentiability anymore. So that means that we can actually do a lot of things that are really hard to differentiate. So that's like neural architecture search, which is effectively trying to find the best neural architecture. So where do you put layers? How many layers do you put? How many nodes in each layer? These are all questions that are super hard to differentiate, because how do you differentiate the number of nodes in a layer with respect to loss? It seems that's hard to do. So the things like this are actually really good for neural architecture search, and they've been demonstrated as such. We also have robot body search. This is like finding the best morphology of a robot to do and accomplish a task. So in these like discrete domains or more symbolic domains, it's really hard to differentiate, because it's hard to differentiate discrete things, usually. And this is something that I'm going to be talking about later in the Machine Learning Club meeting, which is objectiveless search, which is searching things purely for being new, and the only fitness is if they're new to you. And it's kind of hard to differentiate the gradient of novelty. It's hard to know what direction do I need to move to be new, although there is current work in this area now. So this is an example of a domain that might need novelty, which is it's called the hard map. So the goal is you start in the bottom left, and the goal is to go to the top left. Now, if you're trying to follow an objective, like in the bottom right image here, if you're trying to find an objective, you're going to go up into that little corner thing and get trapped. You're never going to actually reach the dot at the top left, which is your goal. But if you instead follow novelty, you can actually spread out and actually reach that goal, because you're doing things that are novel instead of doing things that are high fitness. And this is something that's actually pretty important of a problem. Reinforcement learning, obviously. So reinforcement learning is pretty hard to differentiate. As of recently, they do have policy gradient methods, but it is something that is still an open question, which is the best way to evaluate reinforcement learning agents. And automatic machine learning. So you can actually use evolution to optimize an entire machine learning pipeline. So like, what learning rate do you use? What loss function do you use? So you're using, how do you differentiate the loss function to use? It's really hard to do, because it's it's a discrete symbolic problem, but it's pretty easily solved with something like evolution. So I wanted to quickly talk about another thing that you could do when you have these discrete things, is you can have these very important neural networks called compositional pattern producing networks, which are basically just neural networks where, first off, they're not really necessarily in layers. They just have an arbitrary topology. And each of those nodes has a different activation function. So like, the activation functions are not like the ones you've seen in this class, but they could be things like the normal distribution. They could be things like an absolute value curve. They could be things like just the identity function. They could be some repeating like modulus function that goes up and down. These are all really good functions, and some of them are really hard to nest and differentiate within each other, although it is very possible. So the reason it's called compositional is because there's functions nested within each other. The reason it's called pattern producing, you'll see on the next slide. And the reason it's a network is because it's a neural network that you actually have. So what you can do with this is you can use a neural network that you evolve to actually create an image. And this is actually really, really cool. So the way you do it is you have on the left, you see here we have an f, which is the function, the compositional pattern producing network. You give it two values. You give it an x and a y value, and it outputs just a value, like a number between 0 and 255. Which is going to be the color of that pixel, okay? So, or the gray value of that pixel. So you can see here, you can take the same function and you change x and y, and you pass in that function for every single pixel, right? The x and y value of that pixel, you feed it in, you get the value of the pixel, and you make it that color. And what you see here is actually, because this function is actually something that has like some similarity, all the pixels have patterns within them, because they came from the same underlying generation function. So this actually allows for a lot of things that we see in nature, like bilateral symmetry and pattern repetition, and a lot of cool things that are also found. So for example, do you think in your DNA there's a separate place that codes for your left hand and your right hand? No, it's likely that you have the same spot that codes for how to make a hand, and then you have another spot that says, I want to make 2 of them, right? So that's really important to have when you have these so-called indirect encodings. You have a small encoding that makes a much bigger phenotype. And your DNA is actually an indirect encoding because you don't have a whole person worth of DNA. The DNA is so much smaller than you, but it can create you, which is really cool. And that's what they're trying to do here because you want to scale up neural evolution to larger domains. So here is a compositional pattern producing network. This is basically you pass in x, y, and then you can get out these really cool shapes and figures. And in the bottom right, you can see these are human selected. So they used humans in the loop for the evolution to select different pictures to actually create really cool patterns that look kind of interesting. So any questions about CPPNs? You might see a lot about these now in the media, and I'll talk about one example of that now. So the question is, now that we have this substrate, can we do it in 3D? So can we make the function, instead of taking just x and y, can we make it take x, y, and z? And the answer is yes. So what these people did, which is a group of researchers from Tufts and UVM in Vermont, they took a CPPN, and they had to have 3 inputs, x, y, and z. And then that neural network can output 3 things. It outputs either bone, muscle, or air. And they ran this on an entire grid, and they used that to create an individual like this. Then they took this individual and built it out of frog cells in real life. And they found that the abilities that that individual learned in simulation, or evolved in simulation, transferred to the frog cells in real life. So this is pretty cool. It's called the xenobots. Let me actually go back. So these muscle cells, you can see that they're red or green. That's just what like pattern that you're actually following to fire. Because the muscles contract and uncontract a different pattern. So that's just whichever one is contracted, whichever one's not contracted. So that whole thing was actually evolved in a loop, where the CPPN that creates an individual was evolved because the CPPN now is the genotype. So we use NEAT to evolve a CPPN that can be used to create one of these. And we actually do the evolution on the CPPN using NEAT. Now, what about 4D? That's the next extension. And this is something called HyperNEAT, which is called hypercube-based neural evolution of augmenting topologies, where this was super far-fetched when I first read this paper. But effectively, you have a hypercube, which is just a thing in 4-dimensional space, and it has a vertex that can be represented by 4 numbers, x, y, w, z. And we can actually take this function, the CPPN, to take in 4 numbers, x, y, w, z, instead of 3 like before, and it can output now the weight of a connection in a neural network between node x, y, and between node x, y, and node y, z. WZ. So you effectively have now a neural network encoding a much bigger neural network. And so that's what HyperNEAT does, where you take a small CPPN, you run it on every pair of nodes in a neural network, and it outputs for that pair what the neural network weight should be of between those 2 nodes. So you now have a tiny neural network that can, when you encode it, can actually create a much bigger neural network, massive neural networks, competitive with machine learning sized neural networks. And what you can do by that is you can do things like this. So you can see here, these neural networks were all evolved with a CPPN as the actual thing that gives it the weights. So the weights were not stored individually. The weights were outputted by another function that says what weight should be. And you can see that they have really cool patterns. So first off, there's a lot of symmetry. And that makes sense, because if we're trying to evolve a robot that can walk, do we really need a separate control structure for the right leg's movement and the left leg's movement? Probably not. It's likely that those would both have the same control structure, or maybe inverses of each other. And those could be easily accomplished by just nesting functions of itself. So the indirect encoding here comes from the fact that the genotype is actually much smaller than the phenotype, and this is really useful for evolving deep neural networks. Excuse me. Now, this also, as I said, exploits regularities, so it actually helps you when you have a lot of regularities in your space. So again, the control structure of left and right leg should probably be either the same or maybe inverses of each other. And so you don't want to have to encode that twice in the genotype. You just want to have to evolve it once and then use it twice, which is really key. So here's just a quick example of some people that did this. This is actually the first paper that used HyperNEAT. Actually used HyperNEAT, this is Jeff Clune, to actually evolve a control structure for a robot, first in simulation, and then they transferred it into a real-life robot that was actually used. So you can see here, this was generation 1, so before much that was generation 0, so no selection happened. generation 1, only one round of that selection happened. Now remember, selection is happening on the CPPN that encodes the neural network, not the neural network itself. All right, so you can see that they're starting to do something. Then after 500 generations, you can see that there's movement happening. And also the movement is very symmetrical. All the legs are sort of moving in the same kind of fashion, which is pretty good to see. Proof of concept, it makes sense that this is what happens. So they're evolved with geometric patterns, and the patterns are actually encoded by another neural network that says what should be the weight at each point. So you can see this is basically just a CPPN. This is the output, this is the output of the CPPN, which is a neural network. And then finally, I think they transfer it to a real robot. Oh, so this is a different simulator with a different robot. So you can see here, 4-legged robot. After 200 generations, it can get some pretty good movement. And this is trial 2. So you can see it actually has a pretty satisfying gait because it has this symmetry that we have and that we really look for when we're looking at robot gaits. So then they transferred it to a real robot here. So I think it's pretty cool that you can take principles as easy as like just evolution, and you can actually get a full robot locomotion happening here. So pretty interesting stuff. OK, so can we think of some other things that have to do with function composition? Well, everyone here, most of you here are probably computer scientists, so you probably know that computer programs could be roughly equated to just a set of function compositions, right? You could have a for loop being a function, and that for loop calls a bunch of code a bunch of times. And so that's what genetic programming really does. So GP is sort of the more general form of neural evolution because almost anything can be represented as an abstract computer program. Like you all write neural networks as computer programs. So you can actually represent neural networks as a GP thing. You can do abstract syntax trees. You can do computer programs. You can even do machine learning pipelines. So actual machine learning systems can be evolved as a computer program. So here's some examples. We again talked about symbolic regression. So if you're trying to do a regression task, but it's not linear necessarily, you want to do symbolic regression, where you instead want to find out exactly what is the function that this neural network is computing. And so you can look, and this is very interpretable, because if you evolve a GP syntax tree, which is the symbolic regression tree, you can actually look at it and see why is it making the predictions that it's making. So this helps if you're doing machine learning and you want to figure out why your model is outputting something for something. You can actually look at it and see the symbolic computations that it's actually doing. Another one, and this is a really promising one, is AutoML, which a lot of you might have heard of, which is evolving machine learning pipelines. So not only do we evolve what architecture do you use for the neural network, not only do you evolve the weights of the neural network, but you evolve the way to learn the weights of the neural network with backpropagation. So you can actually learn a loss function that you use. You can actually learn like a data clustering. You can use a validation rule. You can learn how to do cross-validation to make sure that your data is, to make sure that your model is actually going to generalize correctly. So these are all things that humans don't have to pick because you can just evolve them randomly, and then the ones that work well stay. And that's sort of the idea here. Another one of them is one that I'm working in mostly, which is called program synthesis. So this is basically, given a program, like say FizzBuzz, for example, output a computer program that can actually solve that problem. So you can see here in this example, I forget what this example is. Oh yeah, this is just the coin change problem. So given a number of cents, return the minimum number of coins needed to make the change. And this program was actually written, I think, with a genetic programming solution. So this program was written by evolution, effectively. This program was evolved. And you can actually see that genetic programming is competitive with the more state-of-the-art code generation like GitHub Copilot. So you can see that GitHub Copilot solved 24 of these program synthesis benchmarks, whereas stack-based GP solved 25. So still competitive. Maybe not. Maybe this might not stand the test of time, but it is currently still state-of-the-art for generating computer programs. OK, so that's pretty much everything I really wanted to talk about in terms of content. So I wanted to end on sort of where the main questions are in evolutionary computation research, and maybe if anyone's interested in answering some of these questions, then you can get into research at EC. So the first thing is scale. It's how do we actually compete with deep learning? Because the deep neural networks that we have in machine learning can be millions and millions of parameters, And it's super hard to evolve something that's millions and millions of parameters long because that theta is going to be massive and super long, and it's going to be hard to do crossover that makes sense. It's going to be hard to do mutation that makes sense, and so it's difficult. So things like hyperneat actually is a good step in the right direction here, because then you can use a small neural network to encode a big neural network, and that big neural network can do the task that you want. Another one, and this is one that's particularly important to me, is diversity. So how do we actually match the diversity seen in nature? Now, as far as a lot of you believe, we all were created by the process of evolution in the same exact process that elephants were made, in the same exact process that giraffes were made, right? So there was no difference between the evolutionary process that created me or a giraffe. It was the exact same one. And so how did you get this diversity? Like, how was evolution open-ended in this way so that I can actually create all these problems and also create solutions for these problems? So this is a really big area of it's called open-endedness research, and there was a workshop at ICLR last year on it, and I think it's heading in the direction of finding diverse solutions is the way that we find really good solutions, because diversity and diverse solutions form the stepping stones to create really, really good ones. And then finally, this is sort of a minor one, is sparsity. So when we have these neural networks that we evolve, we don't have them to be fully connected, right? We don't need them to have a connection between everything in a fully connected layer. We can have it sparse. But the problem is all of our modern hardware really is taking advantage of the fact that they're fully connected, because you do a couple matrix multiplications and it works really well. So there's no real benefit to having sparse representations. But with neuromorphic computing and with new architectures that are on your computer that's going to help you take advantage of sparse neural networks, it actually could become much more performant than if we were doing backpropagation. So you can actually run an evolutionary search way, way faster than you could run a machine learning backprop system. So yeah, that's everything. And now I have time for a couple questions if anyone has any, or any comments at all. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, yeah. No, go ahead.
When you're doing the selection, is there a way you can do multiple selections, or can you really only do one?
Do you mean like multiple selection steps?
Yeah.
Oh, there's nothing stopping you from doing multiple selections. You can do selection however you want. You can use tournament selection first, and then use Lexicase selection on top of that, and then use fitness proportion selection on top of that, and then do random selection at the end. It's open, it's up to you. And there's a lot of research into how do you define the best selection algorithms. Yeah. What about you? Mm-hmm. Oh, there's a lot of things that backprop does better. So I don't want to be misleading here. It's not entirely like a win for evolution. Did I miss the slide? Yeah.
You did mention that evolution is a lot better at differentiating, hard to differentiate stuff.
Right. So on things that are easy to differentiate, backpropagation does way better than evolution does usually. So because when you actually know what direction to move in, besides the example of the novelty search thing, if you know what direction is leading to improvement, there's no reason to make solutions that are worse. So what evolution does is it makes a bunch of random changes, and some of them are going to be better, some of them are going to be worse, and you just pick the ones that are better. If you already know a function to just purely generate better solutions, you can just use that function, and so a backprop would actually be better there. But that's a good question as well. And that's also an open area of where do you use backprop in problems and where do you use non-differentiable things. Anything else? All right. Cool. So if anyone has any questions more specific, feel free to come back after I can talk to you about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you very much.
Very good job. Cool.
So for the remainder of class, and by the way,